Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to give it another 1 or 2 minutes, see if a few more folks will pop on. So feel free to take a moment here. Thanks. All right, it's 3 minutes past the hour. I see a few other folks joining, but we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us. Before we get going, I just want to a couple of housekeeping notes. We will be recording the presentation, but we will turn off the recording for Q&A. We will share the slides and the recording on our website, indigenousfoodandag.com. I'll double check that after this, so you'll have all of these resources. If you do have any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat. You can also add your questions to the chat or use the Q&A function. I will try my best to keep an eye on the chat as well to make sure that I'm following that, keeping up with that. We do ask that you please keep yourself muted unless you are asking a question. All right, we'll go ahead and get started then. My name is Mai Nguyen. I am the Associate Director of Policy, Research, and Tribal Governance at IFAI, the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. I recognize some of the folks here on this call with us. Thanks so much for joining us. If we have not met in the past, please don't hesitate to reach out anytime. I would love to hear from you and connect and see how we can be good partners in this work. Today we'll be covering a couple different things. We'll be discussing what is the Farm Bill, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but it's always helpful to do a little bit of a refresher. How we got to 2026 without a Farm Bill. We were supposed to have one back in 2023, which is, for those of you keeping track, 3 years ago. We'll spend the bulk of the time today discussing provisions in the 2026 Senate Farm Bill and how it compares to the House-passed Farm Bill from earlier this year. We won't go through every single provision, but I will provide resources throughout for you to find our detailed analyses on the IFAI website. We'll also touch briefly on where we can expect this to go in the future. So starting out, let's start with what is the Farm Bill and how did we get here? Many of you will already be familiar that the Farm Bill is a multi-year law that reauthorizes, modifies, and creates new food and agriculture programs at the USDA. It's what we call an omnibus legislation. It covers a huge range of things across 12 different titles, which I have listed here. Typically, the Farm Bill is reauthorized every 5 years, but we are very, very, very late. The last time Congress actually passed a Farm Bill was back in 2018, which is a real watershed moment for Indian country. That was a Farm Bill that had an enormous number of tribal-specific provisions and really took many steps towards advancing tribal parity and tribal sovereignty at USDA. The 2018 Farm Bill expired back in September 2023, almost 3 years ago. But Congress at the time was unable to reach an agreement, and so they passed a 1-year extension to September 2024. In 2024, there was a little bit of motion. We saw both the House and the Senate Agriculture Committees advanced their own versions of the Farm Bill. The two versions were relatively different. One was led by the Republican-led House, and the other was led by the Democrat-led Senate. While both of these bills included many provisions supporting tribes in Indian country, neither of the bills moved forward due to, pretty significant partisan disagreement as well as other priorities at the time. That meant that Congress had to pass a second one-year extension to September 2025 last year. In early 2025, we had a significant change in power. The 119th Congress began with Republican control of the White House, Senate, and House, where previously we had split power. In July 2025, almost exactly a year ago now, Congress passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or H.R. 1. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, even though this is a webinar on the Senate Farm Bill. OBBA contains numerous provisions that are typically passed in the Farm Bill. These include what I think are some of the most consequential changes that we have seen in recent history to SNAP programs that are going to have significant impacts on tribes and tribal citizens. The biggest and most consequential changes that I just want to linger on a little bit here are changes to SNAP. I'm going to go through these kind of in order of when they became effective. So beginning last year, OBBA eliminated a energy savings deduction for determining household income. That meant that you're no longer able to subtract that benefit from your income, which is then used to determine SNAP eligibility. If you were right on the edge of SNAP eligibility, that means that you maybe fell out of SNAP eligibility, whilst for other folks, and you see a reduction in SNAP benefits. There is also an expansion in the work requirements for what are called able-bodied adults without dependents. This used to be a subset of adults who did not have children below the age of 18. In that case, these so-called ABODs were only eligible for SNAP for 3 months in a year unless they were involved in work training or education. OBBA significantly expanded the definition of able-bodied adults to be all adults between the ages 18 to 64 who don't have a child under the age of 14. In other words, a child in elementary or middle school. One of the significant differences here, though, is that members of federally recognized tribes became fully exempt from ABOD requirements, recognizing the increased difficulty securing employment in and around Indian reservations. That rule became effective last July. USDA has promulgated some very, very minimal guidance to states on this, basically explaining the definition of a member of a federally recognized tribe, but didn't really provide any guidance on accepting tribal IDs or other types of documentation to prove citizenship. So this may be, as we move forward, an area where there needs to be a little bit of education at USDA. Similarly to the elimination of the deduction for LIHEAP, we also had a deduction for certain internet service payment deductions for low-income families. Again, this was originally used to reduce income, which was used to determine SNAP benefits. Without it, some folks are going to lose SNAP eligibility and others may have reduced SNAP benefits. Turning to this year's, when we're going to see some of the more consequential changes, we're going to see limited future updates to the Thrifty Food Plan, which underlies the SNAP benefit. That means the size of the benefit will increasingly not reflect the actual cost of food. And then really, I think consequentially, this October, states are going to assume a greater cost share for SNAP administration. Right now, states and the federal government share the cost of administering SNAP 50-50. That's going to shift to 75-25, with states taking up an increased administrative cost. Because of this increased cost, states are probably going to have to shift around resources, maybe switch around some eligibility requirements or benefits in order to keep up with this payment. Really concerningly, we've learned recently that in some states, SNAP is administered at the county level and counties are required to cover part or all of the cost of the state's cost share. Obviously, in counties that have high rates of SNAP participation and therefore lower income, higher rates of poverty, that county is going to be less able to absorb the increased cost of that cost share. We think this will be especially impactful in counties with a lot of tribes and Indian reservations, where there is likely to be an even lower tax base and economic activity, which will make it even that more difficult for these counties with tribes to administer SNAP. So that's something that we're going to be keeping a close eye on this September. Beginning next year, states will also be responsible for a cost share of the SNAP benefits based on the level of their error rates. This is going to cost on the order of tens to hundreds of millions, for some states even multiple billions, with the consequence that, states are really going to have to cut services, increase eligibility requirements, or even in some cases leave the program entirely. To give you a picture of what this looks like, this is an analysis from FRAC, which shows the cost of these changes to every state. Darker green colors are going to cost states more. So we're really talking about, on the low end, tens of millions up to 1 to 2 billion. And this will have really enormous consequences on access to food for millions of people. And the reason that I am belaboring this point a little bit on a webinar on Senate Farm Bill is that this SNAP cost share benefit is going to be a real barrier to actually passing any new Farm Bill changes, as we'll see later on. So in addition to changes to the nutrition program, OBBA made a bunch of other changes that you would typically see in the Farm Bill. These are things like reauthorizing and funding conservation programs, changes to risk management programs, as well as changes and updates to disaster assistance. I'm not going to go through all of these things here, but if you are interested in learning more about the impacts of OBBA on Indian country and particularly tribal food and agriculture programs, we do have a detailed analysis on our website. This QR code will take you there, as well as this link. Okay. What does this actually mean for the Farm Bill? Like, why do we care? The main thing is that by pulling out the nutrition programs into this separate bill, as well as some of these other changes, you're breaking the traditional Farm Bill coalition. Every single Farm Bill has passed on a bipartisan basis, where typically folks who are really advocating for increased nutrition program support come together with people who really want to support farm business and production and conservation programs, and come to agreement on that funding level that's going to work for everyone. By removing the nutrition programs, the folks who would have supported the bill to support SNAP may no longer support it. And in particular, that's going to mean Democrats are generally going to oppose these changes to the nutrition program and therefore the new Farm Bill, making it that much more difficult to come to an agreement on what of text we're going to get in the end. All right. Congress passed OBBA last July. The remaining Farm Bill programs that weren't covered in it were expired in September. And then last December, Congress passed yet again another one-year extension of the Farm Bill. This year, we finally saw some action on the Farm Bill. The House introduced their own version of the Farm Bill, which they passed in April. Again, we're going to talk about where there are some differences and overlap with the Senate Farm Bill, but we're not going to go section by section on this. But we do have a lot of resources on the House Farm Bill on our website. This QR code will take you there. We have key takeaways, we have highlights, we have a detailed analysis, amendment trackers, what have you. So if you have any questions about that materials, please don't hesitate to reach out. Okay. So the House passed their version of the Farm Bill. We've been waiting around for the Senate, and the Senate finally introduced their version in June 2026, so just last month. We're going to go through what we think are some of the more significant provisions in the Farm Bill, the Senate Farm Bill today. Please don't hesitate to interrupt, ask any questions, or you can hold them until the end. Again, we won't be going through every single provision, but some of the more impactful ones that we want to highlight for you. All right, starting with Title One, the commodities title. The commodities title typically deals with things like commodity price support, but a lot of that was covered in OBBA. So what we are left with are some of the changes to things like disaster assistance. One of the more important changes we've seen is that this bill would amend ELAP to allow payments for transportation costs related to hauling feed and water during adverse weather and during drought. In practice, ELAP is already doing that, but this is making it explicitly allowed. It creates a new specialty crop disaster assistance framework, which will help, we think, speed along disaster assistance for specialty crop growers and provide a little bit more predictability. Right now, we don't really have a framework for specialty crop disaster assistance the same way that we do for commodity crops. And as a result, when there is a disaster, folks who are growing specialty crops often have to rely on kind of like a hodgepodge of different disaster assistance programs. We also see that specialty crop growers are often overlooked when there is a disaster assistance supplemental, such as the bridge payments last year, where the majority of it was set aside for commodity crop growers. They're also making a new change to kind of insulate the Farm Service Agency against government shutdowns. As you'll remember, we had a record-breaking government shutdown last fall where the government was shut down for almost 2 months. For the first month or so of that, FSA county offices were closed, which blocked the processing of many, many different types of loans, as well as disaster assistance and your regular technical assistance. So this provision in the commodities title would allow FSA to continue processing certain types of loans, even during a government shutdown. We think that this is promising, although the place that would be the most helpful for tribal producers would be allowing FSA to continue endorsing two-party checks during a shutdown. During last year's shutdown, a lot of producers had those checks, but they couldn't cash them because FSA wasn't open and wouldn't process those checks. Both of the specialty crop assistance and FSA processing loan changes were in the House bill, but the House bill did not include anything on ELAP. Moving on to conservation, the Senate Farm Bill includes fairly significant cuts to popular conservation programs, including a $1.92 billion cut to EQIP and a $200 million cut to CSP. The House legislation also cut EQIP, but by a lesser amount, and did not make any changes to CSP. Both these programs are extremely popular. They are both very oversubscribed. So these cuts will mean that it'll be that much harder to secure CSP or EQIP funding for a farm. Excuse me. For the first time ever, both the House and the Senate would require NRCS to regularly review and update conservation practice standards. There is a process right now to do it, but it's a little bit unclear what the timeline is or what the process would be. So this updated process is hoping to provide more regularity and making sure that the most recent the most up-to-date information is being integrated into conservation practice standards. One place here where I think the House is doing a lot better than the Senate is the House provision explicitly includes consideration of traditional ecological knowledge and directs NRCS to actively seek input from tribal entities. So that's not tribal consultation, but it does mean an incorporation of these different types of practices that otherwise are often not incorporated into NRCS conservation practice standards. Finally, or not finally, but another change is in the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program. The Senate Farm Bill is increasing the federal cost share from 50 to 60%, which should make it easier for tribal producers to participate in this program. The House here has made similar changes, but slightly tweaked. The federal cost share is a little bit higher at 65%, and they had a set aside increased cost share of 90% for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. So that's not a provision that is specific to tribes or tribal producers, but tribal producers count as socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, and so would be eligible for that much higher cost share and therefore increased ability to participate in the program. Um, the Senate Farm Bill also made pretty significant many changes to the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP, which is this larger program to allow partnerships between states, the federal government, local entities, tribes, and so on to address conservation standards as conservation programs. Under the Senate provision, USDA would have 180 days to review partnership agreements and approve or disapprove of them. So that's aiming to speed up that process. It clarifies that RCPP can be used to address flooding and drought issues. And it gives new priority to projects that build partnerships with tribes, in addition to states and local governments. Previously, projects that were done in partnership with state and local governments were given priority, but there wasn't a similar one for working with tribes. It authorizes advance payments, which as we all know is really, really helpful for more resource limited partnerships who don't have the upfront money to do these programs and then wait for reimbursement. It does cap federal cost share at 15 million, but does allow an increase in direct cost share from 10% to 15%. The House made very similar changes, although I will say that they did not add priority for partnerships with tribes. They had an additional requirement that USDA has to make payments to RCPP participants within 30 days of receiving the receipt, and it does not put a cap on the federal contribution. That said, we know that alternative funding agreements are pretty popular with tribes for participating in RCPP because it gives them a lot more flexibility in implementing the program and what kinds of projects they're able to do. Previously, there was no minimum cost share for an alternative funding agreement, but the House bill would establish a new 50% cost share, which may make it prohibitive for tribes to participate in these agreements. We also saw some changes to the Emergency Conservation Program, particularly in the Senate, that I think will be fairly consequential, is it allows ECP to now be used to replace or restore farmland and conservation structures. Previously, ECP was pretty much restricted just to fencing, so now you're able to use this funding for a wider range of farm infrastructure. It authorizes advance payments, an increased advance payment percentage, depending on the type of repair or replacement that you're doing, and expand eligibility to the program for farmers and ranchers who are operating on federal or state land through a lease or a permit. The House made similar changes to advance payments, but they did not expand eligible costs to farm structures or to producers on federal or state land. Finally, what I think is one of the biggest changes in the conservation title is the Senate Farm Bill establishes a new state conservation assistance program. And the idea here is to provide funding to help support existing state or tribal programs on state conservation that deal with improving soil health, wildlife habitat, or other local resource concerns. The federal cost share is enhanced for tribes. It would be 75% federal cost share for tribes compared to 50% for states, with a maximum federal contribution of $5 million per project. The funding for the program is relatively small, given the potential size of these projects. It's up to 50 million per year for 5 years. But we think this could be a really, really useful new source of funding for tribes that are running their own conservation programs. The House has a very similar provision, but they call theirs a state soil health assistance program. It would operate in the exact same way, but it would be focused entirely on projects that support soil health. So it would not include things that are supporting wildlife habitat or other local resource concerns. The House is also providing quite a bit more funding at 100 million per year. Okay, moving on to nutrition. The nutrition title has quite a few changes to FDIPR that we think will have some mixed effects. First, the Senate Farm Bill would require USDA to consult with tribes and tribal organizations prior to entering into a new warehousing or distribution contract for FDIPR and requires them to consider tribal feedback throughout that evaluation process. In general, we are definitely pro more tribal consultation and more tribal input. But in this particular case, we do think that there could be a potential conflict of interest that arises down the line if a tribe is ever interested in competing for one of these warehouse or distribution contracts. If that tribe had been part of the consultation that then was used to determine those eligibility requirements, that could be interpreted as a conflict of interest under federal procurement rules. The approach that we have advocated for and that USDA actually implemented during the 2024 the 2024 FDIPR warehouse crisis was to include tribal representation and tribal input on what's called the technical specifications board. And this is basically a board that develops the specifications for the search and says basically, you know, what does a vendor need to have to compete for this contract? And so the tribal people who serve on that committee are never evaluating applications or anything like that, which would eliminate that potential conflict of interest concern. That is what they did in the 2024 warehouse crisis. NAFTA requested and was able to place several representatives on that technical specifications board. And so we would advocate for continuing that process in future contracting decisions. The Senate Farm Bill also requires USDA to designate an emergency contractor within 45 days for CSP or FDIPR if there is a supply chain crisis, including one caused by a warehousing issue. Again, back in 2024, during that crisis, USDA did name one of these emergency contractors, and so it is useful to have this in as a requirement, but the impact we think might be a little bit limited. There aren't that many contractors out there who would be able to effectively step in, much less on a very short notice like that. And then even though USDA can offer this contract, there is no requirement, you know, we can't force a contractor to take that contract. So there might not be anyone who is willing to take it up. That said, still useful. This bill would authorize USDA to provide direct payments or reimbursements to FDIPR ITOs for food purchases during a supply chain disruption. We think this is really, really promising. Again, during the 2024 supply chain disruption, a lot of tribes had to dip into their own funds or use other resources to supplement the federal government and purchase foods for their people. While tribes ultimately did get reimbursed for those payments, at the time, it wasn't clear that they would be, or that they would be fully made whole. So having this requirement here, and in particular to make direct payments, you don't have to wait for reimbursement, it would be really helpful. It also requires USDA to conduct annual consultations with tribes on CSFP and to implement CSFP in a way that is responsive to the needs of tribes. Right now, there are at least 2 consultations on FDIPR every year. There have not been regular consultations on CSFP. These changes in the Senate bill were not included in the House bill. The Senate also, both the Senate and the House are creating a pilot program for home delivery of CSFP food packages. I know that a lot of ITOs and tribes are already doing this, but this could be a new source of funding to help defray the cost of doing those home deliveries. And then there's a new provision that would allow some flexibility, give states flexibility in how they staff SNAP. Right now, SNAP certification and so on has to be done by specific state agencies and staff with specific training. During the pandemic and during a surge in enrollment, states were sometimes not able to scale up and register everyone who is interested. And so having this flexibility to allow states to contract to third parties might be helpful in those kinds of circumstances. This is something that we have some mixed feelings about. On the one hand, if a state has a contractor who has a lot of experience in Indian country, who is maybe based in Indian country, has offices on a reservation, that could make it easier for tribal citizens to become certified and enroll in SNAP. On the flip side, this is a step towards privatizing the SNAP process. Some states have tried to do this in the past and found that contractors weren't really able um, uh, to effectively certify and enroll folks into SNAP, and it led to a lot of folks missing their benefits. So this is kind of a double-edged sword. The Senate bill does put a lot of guardrails on what these contractors could do, while the House does not. Last thing I'm going to cover in the nutrition farm bill, the nutrition title. Many of you will remember LFPA, the local food purchasing agreement program that allows states and tribes to purchase food locally for distribution to their communities. The program was canceled last year, but both the Senate and the House are trying to bring it back in a new form. It would essentially be the same program, a non-competitive program for states and tribes to purchase locally produced food for distribution to their communities. The key changes, though, is that in the Senate bill, 50% of the food must be purchased from small or mid-sized producers, beginning farmers or ranchers, or veteran farmers or ranchers. Previously, the requirement was to purchase 50% of food from underserved producers in particular. Under this new version of the program, 10% of the funds would be set aside for tribes, and there would be an authorization of appropriations of up to $200 million every year. That $200 million is a lot less than what LFPA had. LFPA had about $1 billion to distribute. We did some internal calculations that showed that around, I don't remember the exact number, but like say around 150 or so million of that went to tribes, which would of course suck up the entire 200 million in appropriations in a single year. 10% of those funds for tribes, that's 20 million divided by 575 tribes. We're really not talking about a lot of money. That said, we are glad to see this program come back in at least some form. And the House bill here did a very similar thing. They just changed the minimum purchase requirement to 25%. I also do want to mention a couple nutrition provisions that were in the House bill, but not in the Senate bill. The House bill included a 638 pilot for CSFP, and it would establish direct USDA to designate an existing office to oversee self-determination contracts and provide $1.2 million in appropriations for that office. Neither of these provisions were included in the Senate, and then neither the House or the Senate bill included provisions making permanent the 638 demonstration for FDIPR. This is almost certainly due to the increase, to a very high CBO estimation of what that would cost. Okay. Moving on to credit, a couple different changes here that we think are very interesting. The credit in the credit section, the Senate would newly allow farm credit system banks to provide loans for essential community facilities in rural areas or tribal areas. Essential community facilities is pretty broad and can range anything from healthcare facilities, community centers, feeding centers, childcare facilities, justice centers, and so on. Up to now, these loans could only really be administered by rural development. Allowing farm credit systems to administer them as well might increase access and make that process a little bit faster. This is a place where the Senate, I think, is increasing access for tribes a little bit better than the House. The House bill is doing a similar thing, but limits these loans to only rural areas. So a tribal project would need to be in a USDA-defined rural area to qualify, while as under the Senate bill, they would just have to be in a tribal area. The Senate Farm Bill also increases FSA loan limits, both for ownership loans and operating loans. Both the Senate and House bill implemented a number of recommendations from the 2024 USDA Tribal Advisory Committee to improve access to credit. These include things like eliminating the cap on the beginner farmer down payment program, increasing the FSA microloan program, allowing distressed loans to be refinanced as direct loans, giving more flexibility in using funds that are set aside for beginning farmers. And I think really, really importantly for our purposes here, allowing borrowers who previously received loan forgiveness to become re-eligible for FSA loans after 7 years. Previously, if you had defaulted on a USDA loan or received loan forgiveness, you were essentially banned from getting an FSA loan ever again. The credit title also newly allows individuals engaged in commercial fishing or in fish processing to access FSA farm operating loans. A key difference here is that the House would allow these fishers to access both operating loans and ownership loans. Oh, and I should fix that typo. I'll fix that before we upload the slides. Okay, moving on to rural development. Sorry, I'm talking for a really long time here, but we're almost done, I promise. Over on rural development, we see a reauthorization of the community facilities grant program for TCUs. Doesn't change the max appropriations, even though it hasn't changed since 2008, and obviously the cost of construction has gone up a lot since then. We're seeing a new program to provide technical assistance to tribes and others on dealing with water and wastewater emergency preparedness, as well as a new grant and low interest loan program for tribes and other rural communities to operate or maintain or improve rural water systems. Yeah. Also in the Senate, we're seeing a new program to help pay for basically water quality testing and filtering to ensure a supply of healthy drinking water. There has been historic underinvestment to ensure safe drinking water access in Indian reservations and more broadly in Indian country. Fixing this problem requires like pretty large substantive federal investment into the infrastructure, water drinking infrastructure. But I think in the meantime, until we're able to get that, helping folks pay for a at-home water filtration system, for example, is a good intervening step. Both bills are making tribes newly eligible for solid waste management grants. And then the Senate Farm Bill is also creating a new zero interest loan program for rural hospitals. This isn't specific for tribes, but based on the eligibility requirements, a lot of healthcare facilities in Indian country will be eligible. We also are seeing a new meat processing grant under rural development. This is a grant to help establish new small and very small meat processing facilities. The Senate Farm Bill is authorizing $25 million per year in appropriations, whilst the House would only provide $3 million, which given the scale of need for these meat processing facilities is not really going to get us that far. Moving on to research and education. We're getting increased funding for education grants for Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian serving institutions. We see a reauthorization of New Beginnings for tribal students, which provides scholarships and so on. And then some changes to how TCUs are funded. One, we're seeing elimination on the cap on the authorization appropriations, which means Congress could at least in principle provide more funding for TCUs, an extension of authorization for endowment funds, and then newly allowing TCUs to use research grant for equipment purchases, maintenance, and so on, just like any other land-grant university, and then eliminates this requirement that TCUs do research through a cooperative agreement with either ARS or some other land-grant university. These last two in particular really help advance TCUs as equivalent to other land-grant institutions. The Senate Farm Bill is also requesting a report on access to extension services in Indian country. I think in general, I'm glad that Congress is taking a look at this, and is finally hearing that there isn't that good access to extension services. But I think that, as we all know, we already know that there isn't adequate access to extension services in Indian country. That's why they created FERTEP, the federally recognized tribe extension program. But without sufficient funding at FERTEP, we're never going to reach that parity in access to extension services. Okay, moving over to forestry, we're seeing some changes to the water source protection program. Namely, they are expanding the eligibility and geographic scope to include adjacent non-federal lands, which is defined to include tribal lands. There is also a reduced cost share and would allow USDA to waive that cost share entirely. So that likely will make it easier for tribes and tribal producers to participate. We're also seeing some changes to Good Neighbor Authority for tribes, explicitly making tribes eligible to participate and allowing tribes to retain revenue from timber sales for restoration projects. Small changes to the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership Program to allow USDA to consider if a proposal supports tribal integrated resource management plans or a tribal forest management plan, in addition to state resource management plan. So essentially, this is putting tribal planning on the same level as state planning for this program. We're seeing some changes to the White Oak Restoration Program that will include tribal input and requiring tribal consultation. There's a lot of interest also in addressing tree nursery shortages, and this bill would direct USDA to develop a national reforestation strategy to include the capacity of tree nurseries, among others, owned and operated by tribes. And it explicitly directs any reforestation strategy to consider traditional ecological knowledge. The Senate also wants to establish a new civilian conservation center, which is essentially a workforce development program to help support forestry and wildland firefighting workforces. There's not a lot of detail on how it works, but among other things, they would have to consult with tribes to help them identify what these workforce needs are. So they are considering what are forestry needs for tribes. We also see some pretty big changes to the tribal forestry protection management program in a big way that I think is pretty positive. Under the Senate Farm Bill, tribes would be allowed to carry out TFPA restoration projects on a significantly wider range of lands. Previously, you could only do these projects on federal lands adjacent to Indian forest and rangeland. Now they can do these activities on Indian forest and rangeland, operated ANC land, and then any forest federal land that is culturally, historically, or geographically important. So it's a much broader program than it was before. The House doesn't have an equivalent provision to this, although it does make a technical correction to make the TFPA 638 demonstration project permanent. That was something that was included in the 2018 Farm Bill. And the Senate Farm Bill, the new Senate Farm Bill, does not make that change. But my general sense here is that it doesn't really change anything. The demonstration project doesn't have a sunset date. So as long as funds are provided, and nothing is passed to eliminate the demonstration project, it'll be able to continue. Okay, in horticulture, we'd see some changes to the local agriculture market program to include food hubs and regional food chain coordination. Unlike the Senate bill, the House would allow land grants to also be used for purchasing special purpose equipment. So things like specialized packaging equipment, specialized processing, cold storage, that kind of thing. That's really beneficial and helpful for small food businesses. That is not included in the Senate. We're also seeing several changes at the expansions at the Office of Urban and Innovative Agriculture. I'm not going to go through all of these, but in particular, it's asking the office to help help producers navigate regulations at USDA, state, tribal, and local governments, as well as to use the resources of those governments to provide technical assistance. Moving on to crop insurance, the only thing I'm going to pull out here is that we're increasing crop insurance subsidies for beginning veteran farmers. The previous subsidy was 10% for 5 years. Now it's up to 15% for the first 2 years and then declining down to 10% for the last 5 years. Finally, and I'm almost done, I promise. Last title, Title 12, miscellaneous. A couple different changes here that I think are interesting. The Senate Farm Bill would newly allow interstate internet sales of state-inspected meat and poultry. Previously, state-inspected meat and poultry could only be sold within the state. This provision would allow direct-to-consumer producers to sell across states online if it's direct to consumers and in normal retail quantities. We don't have an equivalent provision in the House, but we think this would be especially helpful for some of those smaller ranchers who are engaged in direct to consumer marketing. We're seeing a new country of origin labeling for certain types of crab and salmon products, particularly certain types of cooked crab and then cooked and canned salmon. So that may also be helpful for any tribes with seafood enterprises to be able to label those as a product of the United States. Finally, this title also codifies the existing Office of Seafood and directs it to improve coordination between USDA and other federal agencies on improving access to and purchasing of domestic seafood. It requires consultation with seafood harvesters and processors, although it does not include a consultation with tribes. The Office of Seafood, we think, could be really beneficial for tribes and tribal fishermen and seafood processors. We worked closely with NAF, and I think I saw someone from NAF here on a NCAI resolution calling on USDA to consult on the Office of Seafood. So hopefully that new office, as it gets stood up, will better integrate tribes. All right. Here is where our full analysis is. You can use this QR code to go to our website, and this is the link as well, where we discuss every single provision that might have any impact on tribes or tribal producers in a little bit more detail than we can do in an hour. Okay, so finally, and I'm going to try to get to this quick to leave some time for questions. What happens now? The big takeaway here, Congress is unlikely to pass a farm bill in 2026. As we discussed earlier, Senate Democrats are going to oppose a farm bill without delay of the SNAP cost share requirements that we discussed in the beginning. That's going to cost states, tens to billions of dollars. Full stop. That's going to be a non-starter for Senate Democrats. In the meantime, the Senate Agriculture Chairman, John Boozman, has been wanting to advance the Farm Bill in committee either this week or next week, but he hasn't been able to because he has really, really close margins in the committee, and one of their committee members is currently absent. So until Senator Mitch McConnell returns from his hospitalization, they aren't going to be able to move on the legislation. That's going to be that's going to be a real problem because we're running out of legislative time for this year, which I know is weird because we're just in July. You're probably thinking we still have 5 months to get a bunch done. But in practice, Congress is out for all of August. They will be out in October because they'll be on the campaign trail for the midterm elections. And they have a ton of other competing priorities right now. So the Farm Bill is going to fall further and further behind unless they're able to get some movement on very, very, very soon. So what we most likely will happen is right now we're in June where they introduced the Farm Bill discussion draft. Maybe we'll get some committee action this month or next month, but I wouldn't hold my breath. The next deadline, the third Farm Bill extension expires September 30. That is also when the current government funding expires. Midterm elections will happen in November. The control of the House may flip, which means that next year there may be a split Congress. Probably sometime this year, we're going to need a fourth Farm Bill extension. And then that leaves us with, the 2023 Farm Bill in 2027 and me giving this exact same presentation a year from now, which I'm sure we will all be thrilled to do. Anyways, thank you for being here with us and listening to me talk for almost an hour. This is my contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out anytime. Genuinely, I really want to hear from you. There's no question too stupid or too basic to ask. There are no stupid questions. We are here to help. We have a lot of resources to help understand these provisions and what that might mean for your program or for your tribe. And we really want to be a resource for you. So I will stop here and open it up for questions. Alrighty. Well, in my old office, we gave the 7 sacred seconds for people to give questions. It doesn't sound like we have any questions at this time, but if you do have any in the future, please feel free to reach out anytime. And have a great rest of your week. Thank you.